Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Orlando Valdez.
Hello. Nice to see you all here today. Well, first I wanted to thank Byron and Casey and Daniel for inviting me to speak with you and be part of this RAIN organization. I've had an opportunity to look at a lot of the literature supporting the actual products, and I'm happy to say there's plenty of evidence to support. So for you circles out there, no worries about the details. I promise you any literature you need I can get for you. For you squares and triangles out there, we're going to go over some of the literature. Now the problem is it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour, and that's one of the things when we start talking about metabolic health and the consequences of the current state of disease that we're in. And as a pediatrician for the last 19 years, my main focus has been on childhood obesity and metabolic disease. Now, just a bit about my background, my actual formal training, I'm a kinesiology major out of UCLA with a nutritional biochemistry minor, and I was attending University of California, San Francisco as medical school. I trained at Primary Children's right here in our backyard and practiced in Utah for 17 years before going to South Carolina, where I currently practice at Grand Strand Pediatrics in Myrtle Beach. As I said, childhood obesity, and we all know this, has been an ongoing issue, and one of the big issues with childhood obesity has been the underlying metabolic consequences. And as we go through this, one of the important parts I want to make clear is inflammation and oxidation are two important themes that are going to go throughout this whole discussion. And with these products, both Sol and Core, there's ample literature to suggest that the antioxidative properties of these two compounds can be very effective in helping to stem the tide of the disease that we've been presented with. Now, as we kind of start the discussion, first I want to make it clear that we're not going to talk about obesity as a disease. Now, the American Medical Association recently came out with a diagnosis for obesity as a disease. In my experience, though, the more important issue really is the underlying metabolic consequences. And in children, for example, we know that obesity rates have risen from 5% in the 70s. Now we're upwards of 20%, with another 10 to 15% being overweight. And we know that 25 to 40% of children that do have obesity actually have evidence of early diabetes or prediabetes. Furthermore, we know that children that are overweight or obese have about a 25% occurrence of prehypertension and hypertension. And more importantly, obesity tracks very strongly into adulthood. In fact, we know about 85% of all children that are obese become obese adults. When we start talking about that, it gets very easy to start to say, well, if we could just stop obesity, we would stop the problem. However, a new term that's going to come out in the news very soon, you'll start hearing about this in the near future, is a thing known as the obesity paradox. And the recent American Academy of Clinical Endocrinologists put out a paper and a statement indicating that 25 to 30% of individuals that are overweight or obese actually have normal metabolic health. And about 1 in 5, 20% of lean individuals have metabolic disease. And for those that are slightly overweight or obese, there may be a survival advantage for certain chronic illnesses. So again, this gets a little more complicated than simply saying, well, if an individual is obese, they're going to be at risk for disease. Well, the risk is up, but they may not have the disease. And that's a very important concept as you speak with your families and the individuals that you're working with to try to include both the Sol and the Core products to let them know we're really trying to help their underlying metabolic health. And antioxidants and other chemicals that are found in the Core product, and we'll talk about those in just a bit, can play a major role in helping to prevent and ameliorate some of the metabolic disease that we're dealing with. Now, as we get into the adult paradigm, and everybody's heard these statistics, and I'm not up here to kind of repeat statistics over and over again, we know that about 34, 35% of adults are obese, and then higher in some populations, and another 20 to 30% are overweight. So we're looking at very high adult obesity and overweight rates. However, only about 34%, 1 in 3 adults actually have metabolic syndrome. Now, the problem with metabolic syndrome is that it is a disease of inflammation. And as we go through some of these other slides, we'll talk a little bit more about the role oxidation plays in creating that inflammatory state. So one of the deals that we want to talk about first to kind of get familiar, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds medically. I just want everybody to be familiar with some of the terms so that as we go through some of the information, it'll kind of have a little more context. And anybody that has any questions after the presentation, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and any supportive literature you might need, I'd be happy to provide as well. Metabolic disease, you can see here what the criteria for diagnoses are. Probably one of the most important, compelling parts of the diagnosis includes the central or truncal obesity that everybody hears about, or the visceral fat. In fact, we know that individuals that have high visceral fat levels have a much higher occurrence of both diabetes and early heart disease or heart attacks at young ages. So what's the issue with the central fat? And one of the big things that we found was inflammation chemicals in people that have visceral fat are much, much higher in their blood. One thing I want everybody to think about is imagine getting a beautiful piece of steak, well marbled, you leave it out overnight accidentally, you planned on cooking it, but you got distracted. You come in the morning and lo and behold, that beautifully marbled steak with a little bit of fat on the edges, all of a sudden is no longer white, now it's brown. What happened to it? This is known as oxidation, or the fats become rancid. That's a state of oxidative stress. And if you can imagine, in our bodies on a regular basis, our fat goes through that very same process of peroxidation or oxidative stress. We know that in individuals that have a higher adiposity, especially central adiposity, these individuals also tend to then have an immune reaction to that oxidative stress where they release inflammatory chemicals. And this is where we start getting into the problems of the combination of obesity and central adiposity with metabolic disease. Some of the common problems that occur, and as you can see, I've included a couple of the names again. You're going to see these names come up quite a bit as we go along. But one of the big issues is we start to increase our inflammatory markers in our blood, and they create absolute havoc. Remember that when we talk about type 2 diabetes, it's a condition of decreased insulin sensitivity. When we talk about heart disease and atherosclerosis, we're talking about inflammatory chemicals in the blood, not only causing narrowing of the arteries, but also increasing the stickiness of the blood or increasing the likelihood for having an actual clot, resulting in a heart attack or a stroke. The other big issue that we want to talk about with regards to the inflammatory state and things that we might do to go about resolving some of this issue really revolve around some of the chemicals that we find in the Rain products, both Sol and Core. One of the big deals that we found in, for example, and I have a slide coming up in just a bit that actually has some of the main constituents of Core, so that anybody that, again, the triangles and squares that are interested in actually discussing the actual compounds, I've included those so that there is no question about which chemicals we're talking about and how they might affect the inflammatory state in individuals that do have evidence of early metabolic disease. But know that thymoquinone, for example, silymarin, a couple of other compounds in these things have been shown in extensive scientific studies as well as clinical studies, not only using in vitro or using cups and glasses, but instead using human beings, have shown dramatic improvements in glucose sensitivity, showing decreases in inflammatory markers in individuals, and improving their overall state of health. And that's really the core of this whole discussion, is knowing that as we go through some of this information, even though, as back in the old days, and I know we've all heard this, the experts have said all along, look, if you just have a healthy diet, you're not going to need supplements, you'll get everything you need from a healthful diet. Well, what we know about that is that the healthy diet is a great idea. However, when you look at the actual national statistics, the information out there with regards to who maintains a healthy diet, we know from the state of Utah, for example, the State Department of Health did a very interesting survey that showed a full 12% of children actually had the vegetable servings in the past 7 days that were recommended. And in the state of South Carolina, only 10% of children actually had the recommended servings of fruits and vegetables throughout the day. So again, we can go back to the healthful diet, but when you look at the actual statistics, getting kids to eat vegetables and fruits, and frankly, getting adults to eat vegetables and fruits and other very important food products that are associated with overall quality health are very low. In fact, a very interesting study showed that over 78% of adults scored less than 2 on a 5-point scale for healthful eating habits. The healthful eating habits that they were discussing included vegetables and fruits, adequate fiber, low sodium, but more importantly, foods that contain essential fatty acids. So for example, 2 to 3 servings of fish a week. So, as we kind of go through some of this information and you're discussing these issues with your families, one thing I'd like to kind of encourage you to discuss is what kind of antioxidant intake does the family maintain? And I guarantee you more times than not, that's going to be the biggest issue and the biggest selling point with regards to helping families understand, look, we've got this. We've got the antioxidants. We've got the essential fatty acids. It's all in both Core and in Sol, and Core specifically with regards to some very important compounds that are now beginning to become named. And this is like back in the 60s when Linus Pauling first discovered vitamin C. Everybody was running around talking about whether or not it was effective. He isolated it, and now we know that it has many health benefits with regards to oxidative stress. It's going to be the same thing with the seed nutrition and some of the chemicals derived from seeds. So why core? Basically, the story of seed technology, you're going to hear from many speakers over the next 2 days that are going to give you more details about that. But an interesting sidelight is 6 months ago in the Journal of Heart, which is the American College of Cardiology's main publication, showed that individuals that ate 1 serving of seeds a day, 60 grams, actually had 15 to 20% decreased occurrence of diabetes and decreased all-cause cardiovascular disease. So going back to the whole idea that many of the nutrients, many of the antioxidant properties actually are found in the seed itself. And we know this when we speak about refined flours and refined grains. We know that they take the germ out. We know they take many of the essential nutrients out. And that's really where much of the problem begins, especially if you look at some of the disease rates as we go from the 70s now into 2014, 2015. You can see on this slide, I also included some information about some of the compounds that are found in core as a primary product, but the important message, and I've got a more extensive slide here in just a minute, is that as you talk with families and they ask you, why should we include a product like core in our family's lifestyle? The answer really does revolve around the antioxidant properties and the ease with which the children and the adults can actually derive some of these benefits. The next bit of information, and this is what I was speaking about or referring to, a few of the Rain core ingredients, and you can see that it's chock full of some very important chemicals, but derived from very common seeds. And we know that, for example, the black cumin has been used for centuries in parts of the world, Asia, the kind of sub-Saharan areas, actually have used black cumin for healing properties for many, many years. And this is true also for milk thistle. We've got cranberry seeds and, you know, the spirulina. We've been talking about that since the 70s, a very high protein source, but also filled with bioflavonoids, filled with polyphenols, filled with some of the other essential nutrients, you know, the alpha lipoic acid, so some of the precursors for the omega-3s that are found in some of the healthful foods like salmon, like trout, that I defy anybody in this room that has children to actually get them to try it, much less eat it on a regular basis. Again, this is one way of making those nutrients available for those individuals. Let's see. I think I'll go back one. Let's see. So, you know, didn't give me a whole lot of time. I'm actually able to take questions if anybody has a few, but I just wanted to kind of leave everybody with a bit of a flavor for what we're talking about some of the antioxidants, but also some of the essential fatty acids. And know that there's plenty of evidence, both in the literature, but also in some of the literature provided by RAIN, to help support you in your discussions with families and make sure that they have the information they need. So as they go to their pediatrician or they go to their family practitioner, instead of coming away feeling confused as though somehow we misled them, instead perhaps going into that encounter and sharing with them some of the information they've learned about some of the antioxidant properties and some of the other important components. So just as some takeaway messages, one of the things that I kind of mentioned is, you know, clearly maintaining a healthful lifestyle is going to be a very important goal for our families, and we would love to be part of that as part of the RAIN organization. Some of the lifestyle factors that have been strongly associated with early cardiovascular disease and death actually include fitness and activity, and I think we've gotten a good sense of that today, both with some of the narratives on film and some of the speakers that have been here already. Also making sure that individuals kind of keep smoking under control, they make sure they sleep well, they have proper blood pressure, so they're checking that, their blood sugars are in the normal range, but most importantly, a healthful diet. And that's where we come in. People are not going to do, and as you remember those slides I showed you just a bit ago, healthy diet is much more difficult to attain, especially in children, than it is in adults, but we know as busy adults, it's also difficult in us as well.